My name is Eric Gentry, and I'm going to be talking to you a little bit today about trauma and the way that trauma affects people that survive traumatic events. But before I do that, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I am a psychotherapist, and I've been working with trauma survivors for the past 34 years, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 15,000 trauma survivors I've sat across from and helped them to heal the effects of traumatic stress. And I'm a board-certified expert in the treatment of traumatic stress, and I'm also the vice president of the International Association of Trauma Professionals. And so I have a lot of experience in doing this, and I want to talk to you a little bit today about giving you some nice understanding of what happens to people who experience events and end up becoming traumatized versus those that are able to kind of come through it and repair and heal and recover on their own. Trauma and traumatic stress have been around since there's been human beings on this planet. If you go all the way back in literature to some of the very first published literature of the ancient Greeks, it's rife with people that have had horrible experiences, and then the impact that those experiences had on their life and their decision making. And even thinking about Odysseus, the book Odyssey, the book Odysseus is about a combat survivor getting home and recovering from his trauma. So it's been around for a long, long time. We've only had the diagnosis since 1980, but we've called it all kinds of things: combat neuroses, railroad spine, neurosis, all of these different names. But starting in 1980, after the influx of so many Vietnam veterans that were suffering from the effects of trauma, it came forward in our field, in our Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, DSM-3, in 1980, what came the term post-traumatic stress disorder. With post-traumatic stress disorder, it's kind of a diagnosis for a collection of symptoms. What I want to talk to you briefly about is how to kind of recognize some of those, and then what works to help people to recover from them. Because, Friedrich Nietzsche said, "That which doesn't kill us makes us stronger." And what's true about that is it's a little bit different when you look with trauma, that a person who experiences trauma, if that trauma is not integrated and resolved, it actually weakens the person, that they diminish in their capacity to cope with everyday life and to be the person that they want to be. But as that trauma gets healed and integrated, they're actually better people. They function better. So our field's finally just getting to the place of where we're beginning to talk about post-traumatic growth. And that's exciting for me, because that's what I've seen happen with a lot of my clients, is that people who integrate and resolve their trauma, what happens is that they end up becoming more resilient, have more satisfying lives, are better functioning after the trauma, after they've healed and integrated that, than they were beforehand. For the past 30 years, there's been this frame or this view of post-traumatic stress as a disease, and as though it's an illness. And there's a lot of us in the field. There's a petition now with several 100,000 professionals' names on it, where what we are asking the field to start to do is to look at trauma and traumatic stress as an injury, and as opposed to an illness. Because what happens when a person goes through an experience that turns into PTSD is it's actually brain injury. It actually damages the way that the brain processes information and is able to function. It doesn't function as well after a person is traumatized than it did before the trauma. And so what happens is when a person goes through an experience, what we've learned, the literature is somewhere around, depending on whose literature you read, somewhere around 10% of the people that go through traumatic events. And, in the past couple of years, we've defined that as actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. If somebody goes through one of those experiences, what we found is about 90% of the people that go through those experiences heal with indigenous support, by getting back involved in their lives, doing positive things, and being able to use what is available to them in their lives. They recover and they function fine. About 10% of those need professional assistance. And those are the folks that end up with PTSD. What turns an event into future PTSD? During a trauma, not everybody gets so scared that their whole physiological system shuts down. And that's what happens with trauma, is that it is such a powerful one moment of terror that in that moment of terror, there is an incredible surge of electrochemical energy inside of the body, that the person gets really scared. And during that period of terror, the brain, there's a jolt of electricity, and there is injury done into the brain. So that when the person comes out, and while they are in that place of terror, it can last for just a few seconds, it can last for a couple of minutes. But what's happening in that moment of terror is that their regular, normal, everyday memory processes have become dysfunctional. They're not encoding, memory's not encoding very well. They're encoding memory with all the sensory stuff, instead of it being like your normal memory where you're talking to yourself and you're able to just kind of, oh, that's a nice brown chair out there, and that person has a really beautiful brooch on. Instead of your memory kind of doing that, what's happening is that it's encoding during the trauma with all that sensory stuff, and the smells, the sounds, the images, and it's all really intense energy, fear, terror, so that each one of those experiences that are encoded during that time of trauma is encoded with a sense of terror. So that after the person survives that trauma, they don't succumb to it, they don't die. What starts happening is that those sensory fragments start coming back up into consciousness while they're laying down to go to sleep, or while they're walking along and they see something that reminds them of that experience. Then what happens is that those fragments of memory come back up into their consciousness, and we call those flashbacks. We call those, if they're happening at night, we call them nightmares. And with every time that those memories come back, because they were encoded during the experience with terror, what's happening is the person remembers that, and they have a terror response inside of them. And if there is one thing that makes trauma survivors different than people that are not trauma survivors, is that people who survive trauma, they perceive a much more dangerous world than people that are not survivors of trauma. People that have lived through and suffered the intensity of that terror, of that experience where they thought they were going to lose their lives. Then what happens is they come out of that, they are constantly perceiving that this thing might happen again just around the corner. So what happens is they develop this sense of hypervigilance. They got stuff intruding into their consciousness, the flashbacks and the nightmares, but they also have this jacked up, heightened sense of arousal that, all of us have these, we are just like our animal cousins, that we have a system inside of us that is built to keep us safe from environmental dangers. And what that system does is that if we are in a context where we're in danger, then that system inside of us adds a whole lot of energy to our body. And it gets us ready to either attack that threat or to run away from that threat. And I know that all of you have heard that before. But what maybe you don't know is that people, after they suffer trauma, is that they perceive now any situation that is in any way at all associated with that trauma, they perceive that situation in the present as dangerous. So that folks who are traumatized, they're walking around in an emotional landmine of a world. Their world is constantly imbued with this sense of danger. And what's happening is that from wake up in the morning to go to bed at night, is that they are constantly walking through this haunted house, that where there's stuff just jumping out at them all day long, which to a person that doesn't have a history of trauma, it's just an aggressive driver on the road. It's just somebody walking down the sidewalk. It's just a dog barking out in the neighborhood. But for somebody that has been scared to death in the past, they hear that, or they see an aggressive driver, or they hear the dog barking, and it's somebody coming after me. I'm going to get hurt. That I'm going to go back to this loss of control and this incredible amount of pain that I've had before. So they walk around in a state of hypervigilance. And what we've learned in the past 6 or 8 or 10 years is that folks that stay in that state of hypervigilance, they are generating symptoms. They're in a constant state of distress. They are, and that constant state of distress produces all of that stress symptoms that we talk about, from everything from irritability to difficulty sleeping to difficulty concentrating, to being a sense of overwhelmed and just difficulty being around people. This kind of constant state of dis-ease is what happens with people that are traumatized. They're in a chronic state of dis-ease, and because they're in that state of chronic arousal, of tension in their bodies, what starts happening is they want relief from that place, because that's a constant state of discomfort. The longer that the person suffers with traumatic stress, the more desperate you start seeing the ways that they're trying to soothe that discomfort, that they start having 2 drinks a night instead of 1. They begin to find themselves sleeping more because they don't want to go out into the world, that they start not doing activities which used to be fun and exciting for them, that they become more and more insular, more and more cloistered in their lives. And what that ends up producing is increasing sense of despair and hopelessness and shutdown. So with traumatic stress, you have this bipolar condition. And people can kind of move back and forth between those two kind of realms. That I may see a person 6 months after a trauma in my office, and they come in and they look like lots of energy. They're shaking, their legs are gone, and they can't sleep, and they're constantly irritated. And I could see that same person maybe 3 years later, and they're completely in despair, and they're flat, and they're looking at the floor, and they can kind of present sometimes as the person's more hypervigilant and aroused and irritated, but it can also be even inside of a single day, the person can go the other way, of where they're just despondent and hopeless and despairing, and so that you got this kind of movement back and forth, and the more symptomatic that they become, and the longer that they kind of have the condition, the more you can kind of see it move between pretty far extremes on that. And everybody has read what's happened to a lot of combat veterans that have had PTSD, is that ends up being so untenable that the person cannot survive it, and they take their own lives. So while I want to make clear that the resolution of traumatic stress is really simple, it is also very serious. And so, anytime, especially for those of you who are watching this, who are not professionals working with traumatic stress, anytime you start to see some of this, what you want to make sure that you're doing is that you are getting that person who's experiencing some of those symptoms of hypervigilance and complete withdrawal and being overwhelmed, and nightmares and flashbacks and distorted perceptions of themselves in the world. All of that stuff, that's the kind of soup of traumatic stress. When those folks are starting to kind of complain of that consistently, you want to make sure that they're sitting across from somebody like me who knows how to help them to walk through the healing of that. But I want to look at the other side of that too, because there's a movement in our field that there's this kind of if you got PTSD, then you need mental health treatment. But anything less than that, people kind of get forgotten about. And so what we know is that there is partial PTSD, and we've kind of euphemistically called that PTS without the D. But a lot of people survive trauma. They don't reach clear to the threshold of where we can kind of put the tag of PTSD on it, but they're still suffering in their lives. And I suspect that that's where a lot of you watching this are going to be interacting with some of those folks, either immediately after an event or several months after, and their symptoms are not to the degree that they have post-traumatic stress disorder, but they're still struggling to get fully back into their lives after a trauma. And that's some place that people who are who are informed friends and caregivers and neighbors can have just an incredibly important impact on helping folks to recover, to regain their resilience, and to become people who are no longer victims of the experiences of their past and can start to be who they choose to be, rather than what all these experiences of the past have programmed them to be. And we have several following videos and activities that are going to help you do just that.